Sleep now, and let the last war fade to silence. Let the clash of gods become the distant echo of thunder rolling away beyond the horizon, and the death of empires the quiet turning of a page in some forgotten chronicle. This is the story of the end and the death, the story of fathers and sons, of the final battle that decided the fate of humanity, the story of a golden throne and a broken dream, of sacrifice beyond measure and victory at the cost of everything. This is the end. This is the death. This is how the Age of Darkness began. In the deepest sanctum of the imperial palace, the emperor prepared for war. For months he had sat upon the golden throne, his matchless psychic power turned inward, holding shut the breach in the webway that threatened to drown Terra in demonic corruption. For months he had watched through other eyes as his sons fought and died, as his palace burned, as the dream he had spent millennia building crumbled to ash and rubble. But now the hour had come. Magnus was defeated in the webway depths, his attempt to break through thwarted by Vulcan's sacrifice. The Astronomicon blazed again with renewed light, and upon the Vengeful Spirit, Horus Lupercal waited, the Warmaster, the favoured son, the vessel of chaos. The great armours were brought forth from the vaults where they had rested since the Great Crusade, were plate of gold and adamantium, worked by the finest artificers of a more hopeful age. The sword that had not been drawn since those distant days was taken from its sheath, its ancient runes beginning to glow with awakened power. Rogel Dawn and Sanguinius came to their father in the throne room, summoned by the gathering of the armourers. They had fought to exhaustion and beyond, holding the walls until there were no more walls to hold. The Praetorians' yellow plate was scarred and battered, evidence of 100 desperate battles. The great angel's white wings were scorched and torn, and wounds that would never fully heal marked his golden armour. They came as a deputation, ready to tell their father that the clocks had run out. But he already knew. "He is going to fight," Sanguinius whispered as they watched the armourers prepare the ancient war gear. "Shall we weep or rejoice?" Dawn replied, his voice barely audible. Perhaps both. For the Emperor to leave his throne meant that he believed he could end this war with a single stroke. It also meant that the situation had grown so desperate that no other option remained. The teleportation to the Vengeful Spirit was not a simple translation of matter from one point to another. The Warmaster's flagship had become something more than a ship. It had merged with the warp, become a palace of nightmares, a temple to the dark gods who had claimed Horus Lupercal as their champion. To enter it was to enter a realm where the laws of reality held no dominion, where time and space bent to the will of chaos. The assault force materialized in darkness, a darkness that seemed alive, that pressed against them with palpable malevolence. Daemons materialized from nothing, horrors born of nightmare and madness. The Custodes and Astartes fought their way through corridors that shifted and changed, through chambers that existed in impossible geometries, through the manifestations of a reality gone mad. They became separated, scattered through the fractured dimensions of the Vengeful Spirit, each group fighting its own desperate battle through the darkness. Constantin Valdor led his sentinels through halls of bone and lakes of blood. Rogel Dawn carved a path through armies of the Neverborn with nothing but his sword and his unbreakable will, and Sanguinius flew alone into the heart of darkness. The Lupercal court was a vast space of fluted columns, with arches springing from their imposts to create a soaring, ribbed ceiling. The floor was polished stone that reflected nothing but shadows. The scale was immense and humbling, an architecture designed to create an artificial infinite, a carrion temple of obsidian and black marble, lit by a rancid glow of bloodlight. In that terrible cathedral, Sanguinius found his brother. Horus Lupercal had become something monstrous. The serpent's scales, his artified cataphractii wargear, encased a form that was no longer entirely human, a monolith of auramite-edged black plate, radiating power that made the air itself recoil. The talon of Horus gleamed on one fist, a weapon that had torn the life from countless worlds. In his other hand he held Worldbreaker, the great maul that had broken empires. But his face, even in the cast of the bloodlight, his face was the face Sanguinius remembered. His smile was the smile Sanguinius had loved. "You came alone," Horus said, and his voice was thunder compressed to human scale. "You shouldn't at Euro have done that. That was unwise." "I had to see you," Sanguinius replied. "With my own eyes, one last time. You wanted to see what is Euro's become of me. I wanted to see if any part of my brother remained." Horus smiled that old familiar smile. All of me remains. I am more myself than I have ever been. I am the soul that I, a soul, finally allowed to breathe. In turn, who I was always meant to become, before he fettered me with inhibitions and blindfolded me with false piety and ignorance. It's too late, brother, Sanguinius said softly. For whom? You wanted to see me. You have. And I have seen you. I have waited for this. Many have dared to assault my court tonight, but you are the only one I wished to see walk through that door. The only one. You are half hoped for it, so fervently. I wanted to look at you again. You are half missed you, Sanguinius. The duel began with perfect stillness. Sanguinius raised his blade, the encarmine, and held his pose, sword high, hand extended, as implacable as the golden effigies that filled the endless hallways of his father's palace. His gaze met his brother's without wavering, though to look into the eyes of Horus was to look into plunging chasms of night. There was nothing there, no pity, no hope, no mercy, not even the hint of intellect. The tear on Horus's cheek seemed an anomaly, for there was no evidence of the emotion that produced it. Fear filled Sanguinius to the top of his throat, enough to make him retch, but he held his pose to declare his defiance. Then the angel was no longer still. He did not move. He ceased to be where he was and existed elsewhere, his wings a blur of white fire, in carmine singing as it carved the air. The first impact of blade against blade was a metallic thundercrack that echoed across the infinite chamber. Horus reacted. The maul rose and swung to swat his brother out of the air. The force of the swing was so great, there was a soaring crack of air displacement. Despite its thunderclap, the maul found nothing. Sanguinius had banked full circle, and in carmine ripped Lupercal's right hip, and then again, full force, into the breast guard. The talon of Horus raked and snapped with enough force to crush the hull of a tank. The maul swung, bruising the air with the crimson trail of the bloodlight fizzing from its head. Neither connected, Sanguinius, wings scything, was inside his brother's guard again, face to face, 6 meters off the deck, driving sword strokes into his chest and face. Each strike deflected from reactive power shielding. Each strike made Lupercal's shield generators howl as they struggled to maintain protective integrity. The talons of the lightning claw closed again, the slam of a bear trap. Sanguinius was already gone, soaring vertically like a launching missile, high into the air above his brother. Under the arching ribs of the lofty ceiling, he turned, inverted and dove, a descending eagle. Sanguinius was making Horus seem ponderous, heavy and cumbersome. The great angel was so fleet he was a golden ray of light, a darting glimmer. He forced the conflict into 3 dimensions, using the air and the space, rejecting the constraints of flat-plane combat. To stay on his feet, on the deck, and square off against his brother like 2 Astartes in a practice cage would be to invite a duel he could not win. He wheeled and dove, slashing across Horus's pauldrons, gouging into his waist, raking his blade across the serpent's scales in passing strikes that shed embers and broken scales. The talon of Horus snapped and tore at empty air. Worldbreaker swung with enough force to split the flagstones, but found nothing. The Morlero head struck the floor again, this time with enough force to split and scatter the flagstones in a long fault line that exposed the underdeck spars. The tumbling slabs and buckling deck plates chased after Sanguinius like an opening crevasse. He looped and landed, square and true on his feet, just beyond the end of the long fracture in the floor. "You lack?" Sanguinius said. The words cut deeper than any blade could. Horus felt his exasperation spike, his perfect brother taunting him, beneath his ethereal dignity. But Sanguinius wasn't being brave for Horus's benefit, he was being brave for his own. The peerless angel had never had to act brave in his life. When you're as powerful as Sanguinius, you're afraid of nothing, and bravery is easy. But he was having to act now, and the defiance was his shield against the terror that gnawed at him. For the peerless Sanguinius to show fear said everything about what Horus had become. Yet Horus was not merely defending, he was learning, adjusting. The behemoth Lupercal was fluid and nimble despite his atrocious mass, matching his adversary in refinement and dexterity. His blows and parries were not mere mindless power, they were subtle, surgical, intuitive. The fight escalated. It expanded beyond the physical, becoming a duel of minds and wills, of souls, of the sorceries of the immaterial. It was 100 duels, all fought at once, combats occurring simultaneously on the mortal plane and the empiric. They assailed each other with every means available, and both shielded themselves against every possible line of attack. Sanguinius' relentless circuits around his ponderous foe had become a kind of dance, nimble, acrobatic, unstinting, elegant. There was intricate grace in his every movement, a demonstration of faultless martial prowess that no one in the universe could replicate. It was dazzling in its exactitude, fluid and pure, almost performative, like a rite or sacred act. But Sanguinius knew he was tiring. The war, the battles on the walls, the endless fighting had taken their toll. His wounds ached, his wings felt leaden, but he would not relent, he would not stop. Because Sanguinius had seen this moment in his visions 1,000 times, he knew how it ended. He had inherited, like Magnus, his father's more esoteric aspect, a state of higher grace, and in that grace, a visionary foresight. The angel's visions had been coming with increasing frequency, sharp thorns snagged in the silk of his thoughts. They had all been glimpses of futures, and in every one of them, this duel ended the same way. Sanguinius fought anyway, not because he hoped to change his fate, but because his death here would serve a purpose. Every wound he inflicted weakened Horus for the battle to come. Every moment he bought gave his father time to reach them. His death would mean something. That was enough. The blade came fast, faster than even Sanguinius could react to. Sometimes a wound is so instant and lethal, slicing through the chambers of the heart, that when a body falls dead, slain upon the moment, there is scarcely a mark on the outside to show the cause. Sanguinius fell. The great angel, the brightest one, the Emperor's most beloved son, crashed to the cold black flagstones of the Lupercal court. His wings spread beneath him like a shroud of broken feathers. His golden armor was dark with blood. His eyes, those beautiful eyes that had inspired hope in billions, stared sightlessly at the ribbed ceiling above. Horus looked down at his brother's corpse. A single tear traced down his cheek, an anomaly, for there was no evidence of the emotion that produced it. The Lupercal's eyes remained fathomless black, the dead eyes of an apex predator. "I offered him a place beside me," he said, and there was a note of authentic sadness in his voice. "I didn't want to kill him. He could have stood at my side, but he refused, to my regret. His refusal made his death necessary." He turned to face the doors of his court. He could feel the approach of another presence, a light in the darkness, a fire in the void. His father had come at last. The Emperor entered the Lupercal court like a blazing sun, and for a moment the shadows recoiled. His golden armor gleamed with an inner light that defied the bloodlit gloom. His war sword burned with psychic fire, the ancient runes engraved on its fuller glowing like captured stars. He moved with the certainty of absolute purpose, his steps carrying him across the broken deck toward the monstrous shape of his first found son. He did not look at Sanguinius's body. He could not afford to. To acknowledge that loss, to feel that grief, would be to give his enemy a weapon to use against him. He had excised a great deal of his emotional core when he rejected the promise of godhood. He had numbed his feelings so that crimes like this could not be turned into weapons against him. But Loken, who knelt nearby having been used as an instrument of the Emperor's will, saw the moment when his lord's gaze flickered to the fallen angel. He saw the infinitesimal tightening of his jaw, the ghost of anguish that passed across his features before it was suppressed. "You have killed my son," the Emperor said. Horus smiled. "Which one, father? I have killed so many of them." "All of them," the Emperor replied. "Every son I ever made. When I look at you, Horus, I see them all dead." The duel began. Words cannot capture what happened next. Human language lacks the vocabulary to describe a battle fought across infinite dimensions, where weapons became worlds and parries became the reshaping of reality itself. They struck at each other with blade and claw, with maul and fire. The physical combat was devastating, each blow a thunderclap, each parry sending shockwaves through the tortured hull of the Vengeful Spirit. The deck cracked and shattered beneath their feet. Bulkheads collapsed. The architecture of the ship screamed as it was twisted by forces beyond material comprehension. The Emperor wielded his weapons with dazzling precision and elegance, the huge warblade and the rending power claw heavy and brutal instruments, designed for lumbering battlecraft, yet he handled them as lightly and deftly as a rapier and dagger. His lithe movements reminded those who watched of Aldari dances, the sequences of a sacred masker, the expression of absolute warfare as art. Horus, an abomination of seething warp flux that seemed almost twice the Emperor's size, was armed even more crudely. His talons were immense industrial pincers, wheezing steam from their pneumatic valves, and his maw was wrought to do nothing more than batter and break. But the behemoth Lupercal was fluid and nimble despite his atrocious mass, matching his adversary in refinement and dexterity. They circled, testing each other. The Emperor made a rapid lunge. Horus sidestepped, and the blade went past his ear. A second thrust, turned aside. The third lunge came at his throat along a center line. Horus had anticipated a thrust to the gut, based on patterns he remembered from watching his father fight during the Great Crusade, but the Emperor was adjusting his tricks because he knew Horus knew them. The old man was magnificent. Horus had forgotten the brilliance of his technique. It was not his father's power, which seemed modest compared to his own limitless supply. It was what he did with it. But the physical fight was only one layer of the conflict. Simultaneously they fought in the realm of mind, psychic warfare on a scale that made the air itself burn with invisible fire. The Emperor assailed his son with visions of the future, showing him the nightmare that chaos would create. Horus countered with memories twisted into weapons, forcing his father to relive every failure, every compromise, every necessary cruelty. And beyond even that, they fought in the warp itself, their essences grappling across dimensions that had no names. The Emperor parried a stroke of Worldbreaker with Chthoniya, with the very world where Horus had been born, manifesting it as a shield of memory in stone. They suddenly stood on the flat top of a dirty rockcrete parapet above a stagnant spillway, the radioactive glare harsh and the stink overwhelming. This was Chthoniya, the hinterland of the Athenat exhaustion, perhaps the very day on which Horus had been found. In pulling off this trick, the Emperor had revealed his understanding of Horus's domain, that everything, and everywhere, and everywhen met in his isochronal nexus, conjoined by the warp, and thus everything was accessible. It's not your father's power, Horus realized. It's what he does with it. Horus riposted with the bloodied battlefields of 100 conquests, each death he had caused becoming a blade to turn against his father. They dueled across the webway, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000,000 murdered futures. Then in some nameless hell of the warp, where the dark gods themselves leaned close to watch, the chamber shifted around them as they fought. The psychoscape changed with every blow. One moment the ruins of the Lupercal court, the next the toxic skies of Chthoniya pressing down on them, then the burning halls of a dying ship, then realms that had no name in any human tongue. Throughout it all, Loken watched from the edges of perception, preserved by a fragment of the Emperor's power. He saw his gene-sire and his lord trade blows that should have ended universes. He saw the golden light of the Emperor flicker and dim under the onslaught of chaos-blessed fury. He saw his father's power, terrible and absolute, slowly but inexorably pushing back the light. The Emperor was losing, physicality shattered. The chips cracked from the edge of the Emperor's warblade as it made contact. Splinters flew from Worldbreaker's haft, metal scabs shaved from Power Claw and Talon. Plate armors, gold and night black alike, buckled in the stress of collision, and then the Emperor fell. A stream of chaogenous power lashed from Horus's palm, flexing and flailing like a lazy whip of lightning. It burned into the Emperor's breastplate, igniting him internally, crushing him into the cold black flagstones, and destroying him atom by atom. The Emperor could not move. He was pinned by slow, incinerating death. He refused to scream or voice his pain. He would not give Horus that satisfaction, but he could not move, except to writhe and spasm. The turning point came from the most unexpected of sources. Olania's person was a perpetual, one of the rare beings blessed, or cursed, with true immortality. He had walked the earth since before the Emperor was born, had seen empires rise and fall, had fought in wars that history had forgotten. He remembered the sun flashing on waters dark as wine, the Pleiades rising to announce the start of sailing season, the fast boats with the bright eyes painted on their bows to stare down daemons and see the way ahead. He had been a soldier in every age, under every flag, and he had carried a simple stone knife across the stars, a weapon older than human memory, a blade that could wound even gods. He had given up his immortality to reach this place. His last death would be his final death, with no resurrection to follow. He had accepted that sacrifice willingly, because he knew what he carried mattered more than his endless life. John Grammaticus was with him, another perpetual, artificial rather than natural, who had served the Cabal's schemes before turning against them. Together with Lichu, one of Urda's wounded warriors, they had walked the paths between worlds, navigating the nightmare geography of a reality in flux. For days they had marked their route through the madness of the warp-touched realm, leaving threads behind them like the ancient sailors of the wine-dark seas. Every knot-old tide was a prayer, every thread a hope that they might find their way back, or that someone else might follow the path they blazed. Acte, the witch who had guided them, had given them a bearing. Not to the Emperor, his light was too dim to track now, but to Horus. The shadow of the Warmaster blazed in the warp like a black sun, impossible to miss. "I have the knife," Ol had told her through the screaming winds. "I need to reach him." And so they did. They emerged into the Lupercal court just as the Emperor fell. Olanius saw the golden figure driven to his knees by a stream of chaogenous power that lashed from Horus's palm. He saw the Emperor writhing, burning, being destroyed atom by atom. He saw the Warmaster standing over his father, victorious, preparing the killing blow. The Emperor could not move. He was pinned by slow, incinerating death, and all his power was not enough to break free. And Olanius did what any soldier would do. He stepped between the god and the monster and raised his ancient knife. "No," he said. It was not a word of power. It was not a psychic assault or a tactical gambit. It was simply a man refusing to let evil triumph, even though he knew it would cost him everything. A mortal man, with nothing but a stone knife and 10,000 years of stubborn courage, standing against the chosen vessel of 4 dark gods. Horus looked at him with something like amusement. This mortal, this insect, dared to stand against the chosen of the gods? "Whoever you are," Horus said, "you have earned my respect." The talon of Horus closed around Olanius' person and ended his long, long life. But in that moment of distraction, as Loken drove Rubio's sword into his Genesire's flank, the last loyal son of Horus striking against his father for the sake of his emperor, the stream of killing power faltered. The Emperor stirred. His mind shield snapped back into place, shielding Loken from the fires that would have consumed him. The Emperor rose. His golden breastplate was scorched black, and his cloak was charred. Blood ran slowly from his nose and the corner of his lip. His war sword rose in his hand, and an asterism of white light flared like a rising sun behind his crowned head. The final exchange began. The final blow was not a physical thing. It was an erasure, a concentrated expression of the Emperor's will that burned through every layer of Horus's defenses and reached the core of what he had become. For one instant, the connection between Horus and the dark gods was severed. For one instant, he was just Horus again, just the son, just the favored child, just the man who had loved his father and been loved in return. In that instant, Horus understood what he had done. He saw the blood on his hands, the corpse of Sanguinius at his feet, the ruin of everything he had once believed in. He felt the horror of it, the unbearable weight of his crimes. "Father," he whispered. "I'm sorry." The Emperor's blade completed its arc. The ancient sword, burning with the last of his power, struck Horus's black heart and unmade him utterly. Body and soul, flesh and spirit, memory and possibility. There would be no resurrection for the Warmaster. No fragment of him would linger in the warp to be reconstituted by his dark patrons. Horus Lupercal was simply and absolutely gone. The backlash of that killing stroke tore through the Emperor like a cascade of broken glass. Every wound Horus had inflicted was magnified 1,000-fold. The damage to his body, already catastrophic, became unsurvivable. He collapsed beside the scorched remains of his son, his golden armor cracked and blackened, his face pale as death. The war was over. The Emperor had won. But the cost was everything. Rogel Dawn found them in the ruins of the Lupercal court. The Praetorian had fought his way through the dying ship with Constantine Valdor at his side, killing 1,000 daemons in the darkness. They had advanced through torrential downpours of water and oil from ruptured tanks and burst hydraulics, the rain sluicing away the last dregs of blackened warp flux from the walls. Klaxons sounded on and off, blaring then faulting out. Cascades of sparks from shorting systems showered down in the drenching rain. But now the daemons were gone, fled with the death of Horus and the withdrawal of the dark god's attention. The Vengeful Spirit was tearing itself free from the palace, returning to real space in a scream of tortured metal. The flagship that had once been the proudest vessel in the Imperium was gradually and brutally realigned to an orbital position it never really left. It tried to recompose itself, screaming from every rivet and stanchion, trying to remember what it used to be. They came to the first of the skulls, human skulls, burned and cracked, jawless, rolling and bouncing down the broken deck like loose rocks from a landslip. Then more, skulls and dirty bones borne by the flood, spinning and clattering around their ankles. So many. They could not bear to estimate a number or imagine where they came from. Then Dawn climbed through a hatch and saw what lay before him. The great chamber was ravaged and derelict. There did not seem to be a single part of it that was not damaged or scarred. The cracked deck was littered with rubble and debris and smears of meat and blood that might once have been human. He saw Sanguinius first, his brother's body laid out on the broken deck, wings spread beneath him like a fallen angel. The wounds upon it were appalling to see. Dawn had known the angel was dead, but to see it, to actually see it, to see the corpse, so brutally mauled and so casually discarded. He saw Horus, the crumpled remains of the War Master, his war plate scorched and blackened, his skull empty of flesh and thought, jaw twisted open in a silent scream. The defleshed skull gazed at Dawn with empty sockets, and he saw his father. Loken was kneeling beside the Emperor's body. The Lunar Wolf, the last loyal son of Horus, looked up at Dawn with eyes that held no words. "You cannot die," Dawn whispered, kneeling at his father's side. "Not now." The Emperor lay on his back, unmoving. Dawn uncoupled his right gauntlet and laid his bare hand gently on the auramite breastplate. There was scarcely a trace of life, no heartbeat he could feel, no rise and fall of the lungs. One of his father's eyes was closed, the other gone entirely. His skin was cold and pale, and his hair was matted with blood. The injuries he had sustained were beyond imagining, wounds that no medicae science could repair, damage that should have killed any being in existence. But he still breathed, barely, a wheezing, laboured rattle of air that Dawn knew too well. He had heard it too many times, in men and Astartes alike. The fact that his father was a demigod giant, with a demigod giant's biology, didn't matter. It was the sound of mortality. It was the soft footsteps of death approaching. He kept himself alive by force of will, Loken said quietly. Just long enough to strike that final blow. He had been injured so badly by then. Valdor stood nearby, gazing down at the Emperor's body, and his eyes were full of tears. Diocletian Koros and the other sentinels were clearly weeping too. It was not their expression of grief that shocked Dawn. To hear the lament of the custodes would be unbearable. But this was utterly silent, and somehow far worse. "Constantine," Dawn said. "We need to get him out of this place." "He lives yet," Valdor replied, his voice thick. "I can feel it." The surviving Blood Angels arrived then, Ralderon, Ikasati, Furio, and perhaps a dozen others, gazing at the scene in mute shock. Their frenzy had passed, replaced by grief that would never fully heal. Valdor raised his spear, ready to attack. "If you've come for more killing, there's nothing left to kill. They are animals," he roared when Dawn grabbed his arm. "Animals drawn to blood. No longer, Constantine. Look at them." The angels' sons were pale and viced with grief, but there was no rage in them, no fury, only devastation. "When last we met, Lord Praetorian," Ralderon said, his voice quiet and creased with pain, "we were in the palace of Terra. Whatever madness overtook us, it has passed. It has been replaced by this." He looked at the bodies, the Emperor Horus and the great angel. "I would rather that madness than this." Dawn closed his eyes. He had prepared himself for defeat. He had prepared himself for victory. He had not prepared himself for this, for triumph that tasted like ash, for salvation that came at the cost of everything that made it worth saving. "We are composing an exit," he said at last. "The Emperor is still alive. We will bring your father, my brother, too. Sanguinius cannot be left here. See to him." "And the War Master, my lord?" Ralderon asked. Valdor's voice was pure venom. "Damn him. Let him burn with his ship." Loken returned to the Emperor's side and knelt. "They will bear you home, my lord," he said softly. "Do not die. Your palace awaits you. I cannot imagine a future that does not have you in it. We need you to guide us and show us how to put back what has been undone." They carried the Emperor from the Vengeful Spirit as the ship died around them. The teleportation beacons flickered to life, establishing a fragile link with the palace below. The surviving Blood Angels bore Sanguinius's body with them, the sons carrying their father home one last time. The custodes lifted the Emperor with reverent care, even as his blood pooled on their golden armor. They left Horus where he had fallen, let him burn with his ship. On Terra, the tide had turned with Horus's death. The daemons that had manifested across the palace began to dissolve, their connection to the material world severed by the retreat of the dark gods. From the smallest vermin breed gnawing bones and collecting skulls amid the corpse heaps, to the cloven-hooved archfiends piercing the sky with their obscene horns, the never-born decayed and demanifested. They left smog behind them, foul air, a spatter of ichor as their protean forms deliquesced the dew of their blood, the rotting stench of their brief and heinous incarnations. But they remained in the memories of those who had seen them as an indelible stain. Daemons had walked the face of the world. Their horror had been seen by human eyes and felt by human senses. Though the never-born vanished, the fact of them lingered in peripheral memory, in pouncing nightmares, in the shuttered rooms of sanity and the cellars of thought. The daemons would always be here, now. The traitor legions, feeling the psychic shockwave of their warmaster's destruction, broke and fled. Units turned. They repositioned. They circled aimlessly. Some quit safe entrenchments and blundered directly into killing fields. The order of their assault collapsed into chaos as the guiding will of Horus Lupercal was snuffed out. But the price of victory was written in the streets of the palace. The Blood Angels had gone mad in the moment of Sanguinius's death. Across the punctured floor of the Vengeful Spirit's great atrium, across the battlefields of Terra, the sons of Sanguinius collapsed in turn, brought down by shared pain as surely as by any mass reactive round. Their bodies thrashed and contorted, hammering the broken deck. Then they rose, and the rage took them. It was more than a flaw of gene seed, more than the corruption of modified genes, more than the yearning hunger of hyperactive omophagae. It was an insanity unlocked by the death of their Primarch, an empathic torment that flashed his life and his murder before their eyes. They shared in his memories, his dreams fulfilled and unfulfilled, his visions realized and unrealized, his nightmares. When the sons of Sanguinius turned, it did not seem like treason, for the angels of Baal turned on friend and foe alike. It seemed more like a madness, a hatred of war itself whereby, deranged beyond a point of control, the Blood Angels tried to destroy war and life in its totality. Sojuk of the White Scars watched it happen. At Hindrus Fort and Mansipalgard, the frenzied and uncontrolled actions of the Blood Angels broke and drove back large traitor divisions that could not have been stopped otherwise. Angels turned to daemons to fight the daemons. Perhaps it was some last wish of the Emperor that his sons should meet the enemy on their own infernal terms. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the madness passed. The Blood Angels emerged from their frenzy, wandering, dazed, or weeping in the ruins. Their rage had collapsed just as the traitors broke, another mystery that could not be explained. The sudden passing of their raging fit and the breaking of the enemy advance were connected, symptoms of the same thing. Something had fundamentally changed. Across the Palatine, the survivors of 100 desperate last stands emerged from the rubble to find that they had somehow impossibly endured. White Scars who had sold their lives dearly discovered that no one had been willing to pay the price. Imperial Fists who had expected to die at Hasgard found themselves chasing a fleeing enemy instead. This end was the end of dreams, this death the death of certainty. All that mankind had trusted as empirical fact was excised from the human psyche, and in its place was crudely transplanted the sly nightmares of the possible. Hearts beat differently now. Minds tilted at an unsettled angle. The limit of what was possible had been extended beyond the wall of reason into the dark forests of the imagination. Mankind could now imagine the worst, and every time it did so, from this moment on, the worst would be worse still. Fafnir ran, wounded unto death but still standing, climbed a heap of the slain, and raised a blood-soaked banner of the Imperium. The pole was bent and the cloth torn. The aquila was missing from the finial. The banner itself was so soaked in blood that its symbols and heraldry were hard to make out. But they knew what it was. "For the Emperor," he cried. It was not a victory shout, it was a prayer, an affirmation that something remained worth fighting for, even now. They brought the Emperor to the Golden Throne. The great machine had been built to manage the Webway project, to allow a human mind to navigate the realm between dimensions. Now it would serve a different purpose. The life support systems, the psychic amplifiers, the arcane technologies of a more hopeful age, all were turned toward a single goal: keeping the Emperor alive. It was not living, what they did to him. It was something far worse than death. They bound him to a machine that would sustain his broken body for eternity, while his mind held shut the breach, in reality that Magnus had torn open. They made him a prisoner of the throne, a sacrifice offered up to save a species that would never truly understand what he had given. Dawn supervised the work himself, his stoic face betraying nothing of the grief that consumed him. Constantin Valdor stood guard, his golden armor still stained with the blood of daemons and the tears he would never acknowledge. The custodes maintained their eternal vigil, though their hearts were broken. And in the depths of the palace, in chambers sealed against all light and hope, the survivors of the heresy began the long work of rebuilding a broken imperium. The war was over. A new war was just beginning. In the centuries that followed, the truth of what had happened aboard the Vengeful Spirit would be buried, obscured, transformed into legend and myth. The nature of chaos would be suppressed, its existence denied to all but the highest authorities. The Primarchs would scatter to the corners of the galaxy or disappear entirely, their purposes fulfilled or abandoned. The Imperium that emerged from the ashes of the heresy would be a darker thing than the one that had burned. Where once there had been dreams of a rational future, now there was only the grim certainty of endless war. Where once the Emperor had rejected worship, now his scattered words were compiled into holy texts, and his image raised in cathedrals across 1,000,000 worlds. The man who had spent his life fighting against the superstitions of the past became a god despite himself. And on the golden throne, bound in eternal agony, the Emperor endured. His mind held shut the gates of the warp. His will sustained the Astronomicon that guided humanity's ships through the void. His sacrifice kept the Imperium alive, though at a cost that no one could truly measure. This was his final gift, not victory, but survival, not hope, but defiance. The chance for humanity to continue, to fight, to endure against the darkness that surrounded it. It was not the ending he had planned. It was not the future he had worked toward for so long. But it was the ending they had been given. Sleep now, if you can. Let the final battle fade to memory. Let the death of dreams become the quiet turning of a page, and the end of an age the beginning of a long, dark night. Dream of an emperor who gave everything for his people, of a war master who loved his father and destroyed him, of an angel who knew how he would die and went to meet it anyway. Dream of Rogel Dawn, carrying his father home through the ruins of everything they had built. Of Constantin Valdor, weeping silently over the body of his lord. Of Loken, the last loyal son of Horus, kneeling vigil over the dying god he had helped to save. Dream of 1,000 heroes whose names will never be remembered, who fought and died in the shadow of greater stories. Of the Imperial Army soldiers who held their posts until the end. Of the custodes who gave their lives in the darkness of the Vengeful Spirit. Of Elenius Person, the immortal who chose to die so that others might live. The siege of Terra is over. The Horus heresy has ended. And in the silence that follows, in the long darkness of the 41st millennium and beyond, humanity endures. Not because they were victorious, not because they were saved, but because they refused to fall. This is the end. This is the death. This is how the Imperium began, until the God Emperor returns.